Welcome everyone to the ABFM virtual workshop for graduate students and early career faculty. This is the second in our series of 3 workshops, and the workshop is focused on applied and engaged research, doing it right. We were supposed to have 3 panelists, but unfortunately, Dr. Carrol was unable to join us. So we have Dr. Deborah Carrol and Dr. Justin Marlowe with us today. I would like to start with asking welcoming, first of all, our panelists, and then asking them to please briefly introduce themselves and provide some background or examples of the applied and engaged research that they do. So we're going to start with Deborah.
Great, thank you, Wie, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I always love the opportunity to provide some advice to early career scholars and graduate students. It's really been a priority of me throughout my career. So I'm Deborah Carrol. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy Management and Analytics at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I also serve as director of the college's Government Finance Research Center. I've been here about 1.5 years. I started, and coming here kind of brought me full circle. So I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I started my career as a public servant, as a budget analyst for the city of Milwaukee. And at that time, that's when I was working on my MPA degree, and I was supposed to finish my MPA and be a budget analyst and a public servant, at least in that regard, for my career. And sort of at the last minute, I decided that I really, really loved the work that I was doing and the people that I worked with, but I didn't love the politics side of it. And so I decided to pursue my PhD to be able to, do that more holistic kind of research that helps to inform policymakers and bureaucrats of kind of the implications of their policy and management decisions. And so I pursued my PhD at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, actually with Justin. We were classmates and had the same advisor in graduate school pursuing our PhDs together. And we're on the job market together, but we're still friends. So that's great. And then I spent 2 years at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I spent 10 years at the University of Georgia, 5 years running a research center at the University of Central Florida, and now moved to UIC. And so when I think about applied and engaged research, I kind of think of them a little bit differently. So as I said, I started as a practitioner. I started as a budget analyst, and my desire to do that research that, again, speaks to the management decisions and policy decisions that folks working in government make has always been a motivator for me and always been really important to me. So I would go so far as to say that nearly all of my work I would consider to be applied. That doesn't mean it has no theoretical basis. I think, it's just as important to have a theoretical basis for applied work, but I've always really focused on those real tangible, practical implications of the work. And then in terms of engaged research, I've done a lot of engagement, probably a little bit more recently than in the earlier part of my career. And so I have, especially working with, we're running 2 research centers, that provides a very sort of nice outward facing infrastructure within universities to be able to engage with the community and do that kind of work. So one example at UCF, right before COVID, I was working with a team doing some focus groups in local community centers and nonprofit organizations to assess the financial literacy of individuals living within kind of a disadvantaged neighborhood in downtown Orlando that UCF decided to plop a new remote campus in the middle of. And unfortunately, that project basically got cut off when COVID hit, and we were no longer able to do that work. And so that's one sort of example. And then more recently, here at UIC, my team is working on a large project that many folks are probably tired of hearing me talk about, but it's a really cool, exciting project. We at the Government Finance Research Center were fortunate enough to receive an appropriation from the state of Illinois that is actually part of the American Rescue Plan Act pass-through funding. And so that is funding a 3-year project in which we are trying to determine how municipalities establish the rates they charge to residents for drinking water. And the work that we're doing, it's mixed methods. There's both quantitative analysis that we've done on secondary data that we've collected. And we also are doing in-depth interviews with water operators and finance directors working in municipal utilities. And the project also, because it was authorized in state legislation, requires us to form and utilize an advisory committee. And so for the project, I have a 15-member advisory committee that helps give us advice, helps get our foot in the door with a lot of these folks who are a bit leery in terms of wanting to talk to us, and just really allows us, I think, to approach the research in the best way possible. And so there's certainly pros and cons of all of these things that I'm sure we'll get into and talk about, but those are just a couple examples to start off with.
Thank you. Justin, your turn.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Wie, for organizing this great opportunity to talk about some really important things. And like Deborah, I'm always happy to converse with folks earlier in their careers, because we can all use all the advice that we can get. And always a pleasure to have the chance to do an appearance with Deborah. Like she said, we were in grad school together back in the day. I remember the first day that I walked into the office that she was in, and she walked in. I had some music playing, and I said, "I'm really sorry if the music is ever too loud, just say so." And she said, "Sure. And if the music is ever not loud enough, I'll just pound on this table and let me know." And that's what it's been like to work with Deborah ever since. It's always straightforward. So it's been a pleasure. So I'm at the moment at the University of Chicago in the School of Public Policy, the Harris School, and I'm fortunate to serve as the associate director of our Center for Municipal Finance, which I can talk a little bit more about in a bit. Prior to that, I was at the University of Washington for 11 years in the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance there. And before that was at the University of Kansas for about 5 years. And prior to grad school, like Deborah, I worked as a management analyst in the city of Marquette, Michigan, and was on kind of the city manager track until my then girlfriend, now wife of 22 years, decided that she didn't want to be a city manager's wife. And so we did a left turn, and things, I think, generally worked out for us for the best. But like Deborah, was very interested in the research and outreach and teaching part of that job. And that's turned out to be a great place to go into academia and to always have those questions about the practice implications of research kind of at the center of everything, certainly that I've done. And so it's always been just kind of always had one foot in the practice world, and applied and engaged research has just been a natural extension of that. So it's a great chance to have the opportunity to discuss that. On some particular projects, so going back a little bit, when I was at the University of Washington, we worked on several of them, including probably the largest that was an evaluation of the feasibility of creating a state bank. There was some interest in creating a public bank in Washington State, much like the one North Dakota has. This has been something that's gotten a lot of attention. It's certainly in the last few years. And I was fortunate to work on that with Sharon Kyoko, my colleague there, and current managing editor of Public Budgeting and Finance. And that project went on for the better part of about 18 months. We can talk all about how it started and where it went, but it took all sorts of unexpected twists and turns. But that was a really good example of a state appropriation, very specific sort of audience around a very particular question that had immediate policy implications. There was a lot of desire to actually do a state bank, to create one sooner than later. And so what started as a feasibility study became kind of a business plan, which then became kind of a defense of a feasibility study around a business plan, and it took all kinds of unexpected twists and turns. So that was probably the largest applied sort of thing I did at the end of my time in Washington. Also worked a little bit while I was there on some questions around public health spending, and worked with the State Department of Health and several local public health departments within the state. And I also worked while I was there on a few projects around public financing of professional sports stadiums, which is a whole different world of applied research, for better or for worse. And happy to talk about that, but was involved in some advisory bodies and doing some actual sort of contract work around evaluating the feasibility of public financing for certain types of stadiums. I've also, in the current role at the Center for Municipal Finance, we do less sort of contract or grant funded work and a lot more kind of producing of products that might be more generally useful. So we have some different data indices that we put together, a lot of them having to do with the municipal bond market. Excuse me, my colleagues there are also working on a whole range of different sort of measurements around property tax, fairness and assessment practices and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit of a different approach to applied work in that it's not answering a particular question for a particular funder, but speaking to kind of more general issues that are always of interest to policymakers and the media and others. And so it's been fun to work on that kind of from a different vantage. And I could talk more about some of the particular kinds of things that we've done there. I've also, for the better part of about a decade, written for practitioner-oriented publications. So for Governing Magazine for a long time, I did a column every other month, and now more recently for Government Finance Review, which is the trade publication of the GFOA. And that's always great and a wonderful opportunity to either talk about research that's been happening or to do maybe a little bit of original analysis or to summarize work that others have been doing and really kind of keep that evidence in focus for the practitioner audience. It's a great platform to do that kind of thing. It's a lot of work and a lot of fun, but you do have to work at it the way that you have to work at just about anything else. But I've been doing that for the better part of about a decade now. And I've also done some work for industry as a development consultant and that sort of thing particularly for companies working in the municipal bond market. And I've also done quite a bit of expert witness work, which is something we can talk about if anyone's interested. Very different sort of a version of applied research, very different set of rules, but the same basic kinds of analytical tools and frameworks and concepts that we bring to bear on our more traditional academic research. So been a lot of fun, but just like Deborah, something that I've kind of always done, hopefully will continue to do, and happy to talk more about some of the ins and outs of how to do it.
Well, thank you to Deb and Justin. And applied and engaged research is something that is very near and dear to me. And so when Carrol Edbin is unfortunately unable to join us, I kind of preemptively assumed one of the kind of co-panelist roles. So I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Wie Yusuf. In addition to being the organizer of the ABFM virtual workshop series, I'm a professor in the School of Public Service at Old Dominion University. And I think in contrast to Deb and Justin, a lot more of my work is currently more contracted work. So grants from NOAA, the Department of Homeland Security. I'm working on some work on social equity right now for DHS and a lot more on the local level in terms of specific projects. One of the examples that I wanted to briefly talk about is a project for NOAA that looks at estimating the economic impacts and the costs for property owners of flooding in the local area here in coastal Virginia, with the idea of better understanding how do we put in place adaptations to flooding that property owners can recoup their investments in relatively quickly, and what kinds of government intervention can we put in place to support property owners as they undertake these types of activities that might reduce some of the productivity losses from not being able to get to work or from damages to their property. So a lot of fun working not just with the data, but then also getting into the community and better understanding what are their preferences for different types of flooding adaptation. Another project at the local level was more recent with the city of Virginia Beach, where the city was in the process of putting together a bond referendum to increase the property tax to pay for flooding infrastructure. So there's a lot of work that I do is much more about coastal resilience and flooding and infrastructure. And the city had asked our team to help them out in terms of kind of packaging the pieces of information that connected the need for a bond referendum and the revenues and the funding and financing for the specific types of flooding infrastructure. And for me, the big learning experience there was really kind of threading the needle between advocating for the bond referendum and providing information that the city could communicate to citizens and taxpayers in a way that could be understandable and that connected their preferences, that as we collected through surveys, preferences of taxpayers and residents with where flooding infrastructure was going to put in place. So it was a big learning experience because nobody wants to pay to vote to tax themselves or to increase debt, but a lot of conversations with residents helped me really understand what were the issues that resonated with them, and to then figure out what pieces of information that we had already collected that we knew about these projects could help them make informed decisions, not one way or the other, not a vote yes or a vote no, but informed decisions according to their preferences. All right, so I'm going to move more to the topic. This workshop is targeted at doctoral students and junior faculty. So could you share with our workshop audience why they might consider applied or engaged research? And what really is it about these types of projects that excite you? Justin, why don't you lead us off?
Sure, glad to. So, I mean, it's a lot of reasons come to mind right away. Some of them may be more obvious than others. But when I think about that question, I think first and foremost, that it's always exciting to have the chance to do something that is going to make a difference, whether it's informing decision-making or at having reframing an issue or helping policymakers maybe better understand an issue. So we all at some level, I think, desire that. We don't necessarily go into this field for the money and the notoriety and all the goodies that come with it. It really is a chance to make an impact and make a difference. And so applied work has the potential to do that in sometimes a much more potent way than our more traditional kinds of academic work. So just being able to be useful and contribute something to the conversation is great. It is an opportunity to get a hold of data and access to people that you might not otherwise be able to get access to. So that can really help to maybe spin off into more traditional types of scholarships. And that's something we should probably talk about a little bit, is that some of the challenges and opportunities that come with trying to translate applied work into more traditional academic research. I think in some ways that's kind of the big challenge and the main thing that we need to be mindful of when we're thinking about the potential for doing applied work. But getting access to resources that you wouldn't otherwise have access to can be very important. It's a great chance to build your professional reputation outside of academia. Not surprisingly, policymakers and journalists and others don't necessarily read all of our scholarly publications, but they are well aware when you put out a white paper or a report or something that gets covered. And a lot of the time, you can be known by legislators and funders and others for your applied work much more than for your scholarship. And so it's a great opportunity to be building a reputation there that can, again, produce all sorts of opportunities for more traditional scholarly research a little bit down the road. I think it's helpful too to have give you kind of an inside look at what's actually happening on the ground. For those of us who worked in government, there's always that desire to kind of keep close to the action and think about how things are the same, but also different from when we were working in the field. And so having that opportunity to get inside programs, talk to people who are actually doing this work and become more familiar with the ins and outs is very valuable. And I think is, again, something that makes applied work and researchers who do it just better informed and just have a richer understanding of what goes on inside government. And that's not to criticize those who don't do it at all, but just that for those of us who do, it's a great opportunity. And then I think the last thing I would say is I've always thought of applied work as one of the real kind of calling cards of our subfield. I think there's always been a tradition within ABFM and within the public budgeting and finance subfield generally that we're always trying to do work that is relevant. We have a kind of built-in advantage in that we're studying outcomes and numbers and indicators that are just inherently of interest to the practice space. And so having that chance to just sort of keep that tradition going and doing something that I think makes our field unique is also a really attractive thing. And I know that within our community of researchers, there's a lot of cachet and a lot of respect, I think, that comes with being someone who is doing a lot of applied work and can translate that applied work into more traditional sorts of scholarship. So when I think about it, those are the things that come to mind right away.
Deb?
Great, yeah. So I think what really motivates me and excites me most about applied research is that I'm a first gen scholar. And so I think throughout my entire career, I've always had a little bit of this sort of blue collar perspective on the work that I do. And so to reiterate, I think what Justin named as his primary motivation, I've always wanted to do something that makes a difference. So I love teaching because I know that I've had an impact on, some of my students' lives. I love doing applied and engaged research because I know that I can have a meaningful impact in, various areas that I choose to engage in. And the impact that you can have, I think, with applied or engaged research, you can really sort of dictate, right? So some of the work that I've done is work that helps government work better, right? So when I was in Florida, I did a project for the Osceola County, which is right next to Orange County, where Orlando is located, their sheriff's office. And so within that county, they had been experiencing really significant shifts in their population, some of which was the result of some of the hurricanes that hit the Texas area at the time, and people had sort of migrated over to Florida. And they also are in a jurisdiction that is sort of very close to Walt Disney World, so they have a lot of tourist population, and they really wanted to be very proactive about getting a handle on what their future personnel needs were going to be so that they could have coverage, right, in terms of sheriffs and maintain order and public safety, right? And so my research very directly helped them with that planning process. On the other side, you can also do engaged and applied work that helps individuals within a community, right? So I'm part of a team right now that is that's looking at property taxes within Cook County, which is the county that Chicago is located in. And we're looking at various aspects of the property tax system, and mostly with an eye towards equity of the system. And so the policy recommendations that will come out of the work and the research that we do will have, those sort of equity based implications to them to help hopefully improve the property tax system. Justin and I are a part of an advisory board right now for another agency that's looking at public transit in the region, which is expected to have a very considerable, I think, $730 million operating deficit once the federal funding runs out starting in 2025. Now, when I moved to Chicago, I only kept my car for a few months. And so I ride all of the public transit in the city. I have a very vested interest in making sure it continues to operate, right? And so some of it is that you're really digging in yourself and doing the work and doing the research. And some of applied and engaged research takes the form of you lending your expertise to help guide others doing the work as well. And so I would reiterate, of course, what Justin said about how it truly can help expand your network and all of those great things that he said. The one thing that maybe I might add to that is that I think applied and engaged research can also help to inform your work better. So for example, going back to the financial literacy work that we had started doing, within those focus groups, we were again talking to individuals who were, come from and live in more disadvantaged communities. And so one of the things that I learned from those focus groups that I just didn't know because of my privileged upbringing is that a lot of individuals, by the time they become adults or even teenagers, their credit is terrible because their parents will take out credit cards in their name when they're infants and then drive up their credit card debt and not pay it off. And now that I've learned that and I've spoken about it with other people, yeah, it's actually a thing. There's a lot of people I know who that happened to when they were young. And so that makes me think about various topics and think about my research in a little bit different way, because I'm better informed about some of these broader trends that I don't have any experience in and cannot learn from any textbook that, at least that I've seen out there. Not that there's amazing textbooks out there. I'm not going to say there aren't, but these are some of the things that you can't just learn out of a textbook.
And I'm going to piggyback off of Deb just in terms of that applied or engaged research can inform your own work. My team recently wrapped up a 3-day virtual workshop on social equity and coastal resilience, with the idea of developing a broader framework for understanding what are the key questions that we need to ask ourselves as we think about coastal resilience in an equitable way moving forward. And as doing the workshop and meeting, bringing together community members, representatives from nonprofits, from tribes, bringing them to that virtual workshop was a great way to extend the network and figure out where my work might better fit and might better help communities. But more importantly, coming out of that conversation, I can now figure out where I might plug in my expertise to address really important questions that help us advance coastal resilience on the ground and into the future. So helping better understand where my work would fit has been a benefit for me of doing some of this applied and engaged research. All right, we're going to switch a little bit because it is time to now get real. What are some of the challenges that you faced doing applied or engaged research, and how can these challenges be overcome? Deb?
Yes, ma'am. So I think because we're speaking to an audience of early career scholars, I will say that probably the biggest challenge that you should be concerned about is the ability to produce peer-reviewed publications out of applied and engaged research. That is your #1 priority to get tenure. And there are some applied and engaged research projects that lend themselves really nicely to that. So the water rate study that I mentioned when I introduced myself is one of those projects where we're collecting a massive amount of data. And we have, I think my team, done a really good job of peeling off some articles from the data and information that we've been collecting. We've already published one peer-reviewed article in the Illinois Municipal Policy Journal. We have another article under review at Public Budgeting and Finance. We are in a couple weeks at the end of the month presenting a 3rd paper at the Urban Affairs Association conference. So finding those projects that can sort of, span both of those needs of being engaged with the community, but also making sure that you're able to produce those peer-reviewed publications to move yourself forward to tenure is very, very important. The Osceola County Sheriff's Office is not one of those projects, right? That was because it's a sheriff's office. There's a lot of concern about information that sort of gets out. And it's very, very sort of nuanced and niche to this one particular agency and what their specific needs are. So I didn't really see a way to kind of publish anything out of that particular project. And then I think the other thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to throw all of your sort of eggs in the basket of, I will be able to publish, a billion things off of this one particular project, because things happen, right? So that financial literacy project that I was talking about literally got interrupted with COVID, and it was the very beginning of COVID, and no one knew what was going on or what we were doing, and the Zoom was not like the thing we did every day back then, right? So it just killed the project. Now, fortunately, we had done kind of some background work, and we were able to produce one peer-reviewed journal article out of it, but we had no actual research findings. We hadn't gotten far enough in the focus groups to really have anything of substance that was going to be publishable in an academic sense. So really kind of thinking about how the applied and engaged research meets your needs is a huge challenge. Other challenges are everything takes much longer than you think it's going to. People are sometimes not very responsive, and you have to be sort of persistent, but also be respectful of people's times, because a lot of these folks are very, very busy, of course. And I think one of the probably biggest challenges, IRB. So most of the research we do, right, is exempt research, because we're talking to individuals in their sort of official capacity, but we still have to go through the IRB process. And if you've not done that before, that can be a bit daunting to learn that process and what needs to be done for that. And then the last thing I'll say is oh, I might have lost it. Is that I think one of the biggest challenges is expectations, right? So I think, you know, you have certain expectations, the folks you engage with have certain expectations, and it sometimes can be difficult to make sure that those expectations are meted in the middle and are on the same page. And in particular, things that I've learned with engaging in the community is that a lot of community members' experience is that, you know, the big fancy folks in their suits from the university come along, talk to them, say they want to help the community, and then they disappear and go publish their papers, but nothing actually ever comes back to the community. And so we have to be really careful to not perpetuate that cycle with the work that we're doing, and be committed to not, you know, just removing ourselves from the community or following through, which a lot of us probably have a tendency to do because we're also very busy and have lots of demands on our time.
Justin, what would you add?
Yeah, I think all that's really well said by Deborah, and I agree completely with everything she said about the scope creep within projects, managing expectations, funding disappearing, access to people and data disappearing. All these things happen. You have to anticipate that. You have to plan for it and make sure that you've got the time and the resources built in to be able to get the project done as it takes all those unexpected twists and turns. So I think that's all, excuse me, really well said, and would add and would 100% agree with the points about how for junior faculty and emerging scholars, just how important it is to be able to show that you can do it, to show that you have the ability and the wherewithal to get applied work done, but to also not let it completely absorb your research agenda, because it is a risky business with respect to getting peer-reviewed publications out the door. So showing that you can do it, putting a placeholder on it for later is important, but not letting it become the main thing that you do, because it can be a problem. What I would add to all of that is, I think one of the biggest challenges, certainly something that we've seen as of late, is that it's very easy to lose control of the narrative surrounding applied work. When you're putting findings out there, suddenly the media can take it in whichever direction they would like. State legislators can take it in whichever direction they would like. There's a lot of what we might call sort of solutions seeking problems out there. And a lot of that work, anyone who has a particular policy solution as their pet policy solution will grab onto your findings and attach your findings to whatever it is that they're looking to promote, whether it actually supports the position that they're taking or not. And that's the risk that you run when you're out there doing applied work, because it's when you're engaged, these sorts of things happen, and it can happen in all sorts of unexpected ways. You know, one thing I'd mentioned before, we had done a little bit of work with the State Department of Health in Washington State, and we had done at one point a study of the different essentially ways that the state Medicaid program could look at to try to reduce costs, or at least think a little bit differently about costs. And so one of the things they had asked us to do was come up with essentially a list of the sort of 50 most expensive conditions that the state Medicaid program treats, and the 50 sort of least expensive conditions that the state Medicaid program treated. And that was mostly just to provide kind of a landscape analysis for the state legislature. And so, not surprisingly, if you're looking for a relatively, not to sound glib about it, but if you're looking for a relatively cheap, efficient, fast way to die, lung cancer comes to mind right away. And there's a few other things like that in the state Medicaid program that most state Medicaid programs cover. And then things like obesity, high blood pressure, hypertension, those sorts of things become very long, expensive ways to die that the state pays for as well. So we're presenting these findings to the state health committee, and a state legislator from a very red part of the state sort of cuts me off mid-sentence, and he says, "So Professor Marlowe, what you're suggesting is that we encourage all the fat people to start smoking." And I said, "That's not exactly what we're suggesting, but you could definitely take the data in that direction if you really, really wanted to." And the point that he was making was that he was really uncomfortable with the idea that we were taking, human beings and the human experience of having to receive healthcare and treating it like just another data point, right? And so the point there was, be really, really careful in thinking about these things purely in cost and benefit terms, especially when you're talking about people's health. And so that you get into, you have to sort of go out there and make a few of those mistakes to figure out exactly how to say things, exactly how to frame things, to make sure that you don't find the way something is presented or see your findings go off in a completely unexpected direction. I think the other big challenge along those lines too is that a lot of what we do does not lend itself to a tweet. A lot of what we do does not lend itself to a short, pithy explanation. A lot of the time, what we're trying to do is help people better understand the full complexity and richness of an issue. And yet what the media wants and what a lot of policy advocates want, what a lot of legislative staff wants are a tweet. And so you have to be thinking about how that will play out and anticipate that a little bit and make sure that you don't find, again, the narrative around your research hijacked. And again, this is where it can be especially fraught as a junior scholar if you have, a reputation for putting findings out there that are maybe more controversial than they actually are because someone has decided to make them controversial. And so a piece of advice on that, and something that maybe we can talk about later, is that it's never a bad idea as a junior faculty member working on this stuff to have a senior person on the team, somebody who can step in and take some of that heat for you, because it can become a very uncomfortable space very quickly. Again, even if you do everything right, even if you perform, if you do the science as well as you can, sometimes you just don't have control over the way it's portrayed out there in the world.
Thanks, Justin. And I would build off of that. I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is that framing. So I do work in climate change and sea level rise, and I primarily engage with communities in rural coastal Virginia, very red counties, for example. And I very early had to learn, and actually some universities have legislative liaisons who can actually be very beneficial in helping you with language and crafting and framing. That in these communities, I can't actually say sea level rise, even though that's what the science calls it. I don't actually say sea level rise. I use terms like recurrent flooding, tidal flooding, coastal inundation, which turns out is a little, I thought that was very sciencey, but people get that pretty quickly. So, sometimes it does require stepping back, and sometimes that is my challenge because, one, I was not raised in the American context, so a lot of sometimes these cultural nuances are lost on me. And second, a lot of times I'm engaging with people who don't look like me, who don't talk like me, and are maybe have very different educational levels or socioeconomic status. And so sometimes relating to those people can be a challenge that requires you to really be very conscious about how you do that. All right. So what are some best practices that you follow when you undertake applied or engaged research? Who wants to go first? Okay, Deb's gonna go.
Yeah, I thought we were about to bag. So I think, I think the typical, suggestions for conducting any type of research apply of being organized and having follow up and that sort of thing. So when I'm thinking about this question, I'm trying to come up with things that maybe are what you would not think of at the onset, and sort of if I had known earlier type things. And so I would say it's really, really important to understand the laws in your state governing this type of research. In particular, Freedom of Information Act laws and how that applies to the research you're doing, document retention and maintenance rules that may govern meetings that you hold within the community, all of those things. And I bring that up because, as I said, the water rate study is funded by the Illinois legislature, right? And so there are very specific things that I have to do because that project is authorized through legislation. And, you know, you have to make sure that you know what that legislation says and that you are delivering specifically what you are required to. So I think, you know, as researchers just doing our own academic research, we tend to let it be a bit of a sort of fluid process, and maybe everyone doesn't, but I see it as kind of a dynamic process, and I follow where the data leads me. And so with applied research, particularly if it's funded, you have to be really careful that you're not sort of, you know, meandering or shifting that focus, because you have very specific deliverables. And those deliverables are things you cannot be late on. And so making sure that you can adhere to those deadlines, that you're setting up realistic budgets and timelines and all of those sorts of things so that you can manage the project and deliver what you said that you were going to do is absolutely crucial, because you won't get invited back to do that kind of work again if you do a bad job. Right. And so I think, you know, and then I think in terms of FOIA, like just as Justin was just saying, expect that you're going to get FOIA'd. If you're doing any sort of project that engages with the community, there's a very high likelihood that the press are going to catch wind of it, and they're going to want documentation, they're going to want to talk to you, whatever the case may be. So make sure that when you are creating the documents that you're creating, when you're building data sets, when you're collecting data, that you are doing what you need to be doing for your state FOIA laws to protect some of that information, especially if it is personally identifying information that should not be revealed. So you want to protect the research and protect the human subjects that you are doing this this research with. And then I would also say having some media training is really, really helpful. I say that because I don't think I'm the best at doing media, but I find myself having to do it, right? I talk to reporters, especially running a research center, a lot. I mean, just a few weeks into coming to UIC and starting this job, you know, I was on primetime TV for the first time ever in my life, and that was terrifying, right? So make sure that you, again, you can come up with those nice sound bites, right? Or those nice quotable things that effectively convey the message you want to convey with the research. And then more broadly, even if you're not just talking to the media, in follow up to what Justin was saying too, make sure that you know how to break down that research and make it very digestible for people who are not going to take the time to read all of it, who maybe don't have the expertise or the level of education to read all of it, but can still get that message that you want to communicate to them.
All right, Justin, go.
Yeah, that's all great advice, and I would agree with all of that, and including on the media part of it. You know, everyone handles these things a little bit differently, but you know, I think I have had and have known lots of people who do applied work who will actually be kind of proactive with respect to the media stuff, instead of waiting to get the call from reporters. Actually going out and saying to them, let's have a conversation. And you'd be surprised how often they're willing to have sort of off the record conversations, particularly about your methodology, how you're going about learning what you're learning, what your study will and won't say. And so that they are better versed on that when it comes time then to go on the record when the findings are released or whatever it might be, that they are be able to report on it in a way that's true to what it actually does. And so the handling of the media stuff can unfold in lots of different ways, and you've got to do what's comfortable for you, and that means something a little bit different for everyone. I think just focusing a little bit more on kind of the internal mechanics of it, I would say as a best practice, it's never a bad idea to keep the people within your department or school informed of what you're doing. If you have a dean or a department chair or a faculty mentor, for those of you who maybe aren't tenured yet, never a bad idea to send them emails every couple of weeks saying, here's what we're doing, here's how it's working, here's what is happening that we expected, here's what's happening that we didn't expect. that has a couple different benefits. A big one, of course, is that a lot of the time the people in those leadership roles don't do applied work. And so just giving them an insight into just how much time and effort it takes to do it well is a good thing, and helps them to be better sensitized to how you're going about doing what you're doing. It also really helps to get out ahead of any potential surprises, especially if something's going to show up in the media, if a state legislator is going to get a hold of something and make a call to a provost who's going to make a call to your boss or whatever it might be. Those are really, really important things to make sure everybody is aware of. And I think, as Deborah said too, managing the grant, managing the expectations is really important. One way that I think we've seen that done really well is, again, the words matter. And so being able to, instead of talking about collaborating with the funder or collaborating with the people who have the say on signing off on the findings, we're happy to check in with you. We're happy to apprise you of what we're doing. We're happy to take comments, but we're not collaborating on this. We've got to do the work that we're going to do. And if you're not careful, let's collaborate opens the door to asking follow-on questions you weren't necessarily prepared to address, or whatever it might be. And so again, managing those expectations and trying to be a little bit firmer than we often are in how we go about doing our other work on who gets to comment, who gets to be involved, and who doesn't can really help to get out ahead of any big potential problems. So when I think about the best practices, those things come to mind right away.
I'll add one more best practice that pulls, I think, quite a bit some of that together is if you are working particularly on a big project, actually having a project manager is really, really helpful. And so if I'm working, for example, on a big DHS project, and we actually just wrapped up a big NSF project last year, having a project manager to keep everybody on the same page when you're working with a team of 10 people can be really, really beneficial. So if you're starting to think about what a project budget might look like, and you think that there will be complexity in there, my best practice is always budget for a project manager. You're never going to regret it. So we're going to wrap up with our last question, which is really just about any advice or insights that you might have to offer.
Yeah, I think I don't know that I have much to add beyond what we've said already. Again, having some senior folks in your corner, either working on it with you or willing to step in for you and advocate for you, especially if things get hot in a way that you don't want them to. Again, pre-tenure, doing some of this to show that you can do it, but not doing so much that it crowds out other really important work. And as Deborah said before, to the extent that you can, you don't often get to pick. To the extent that you do have the ability to pick, trying to pick stuff that you know has a better chance of producing some peer-reviewed publications is always going to be the best first strategy. And that may not be the most interesting or the most exciting or the most salient stuff, but you'll have time for that later once you're tenured and once you have a reputation as someone who does good applied work. Those opportunities will come later on.
Deb?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with all of that. That's really great advice, Justin. The two other things that I would add that I didn't touch on yet are that remember that we are not normal people, right? Normal people do not get PhDs. We are a very, very select segment of the population. And so when you're doing engaged research, don't go into it assuming that you know and understand the lived experiences of the individuals that you're engaging with, because chances are you don't, and chances are they're going to be very different from you, and you need to be sensitive to those lived experiences, particularly if they're sharing those with you. So that's number one. And then number two, if you find good team members, hang on to them for dear life, because there is nothing that can make or break a project, especially applied engaged work, than having really, really great people around you that you can depend on, that are organized, that can add value to the team and to the work. And I've worked with people that I barely know. I've done grant proposals with people I barely know, and that's actually very hard, right? Where you meet people for the first time, and all of a sudden you're trying to write a 30-page grant proposal. That's a really, really challenging thing to do. I don't recommend that you try to do that, right? Work with the people you know, work with the people who you know do good work and that you can work really well with, and keep collaborating with those folks. Don't let them out of your sight. That's it.
All right, I'll add two more. One is know the resources at your institution. Justin and Deb both talked about kind of, media relations, and the first few interviews that I did, I actually had somebody from our StatCom office holding my hand, like being in my office while I was being interviewed, because I had no clue. As soon as it was set up, I was like, okay, tell me what I need to know. And then she offered to sit in the interview with me. I was like, yes, please come. So know what resources are available. ODU also has a legislative liaison that was really beneficial for me as I navigated working with state legislators on some of these coastal resilience issues. So know what resources are available, because you don't have to go at it alone. The other thing that I wanted to basically add is just, you look at Deb and Justin and myself, we've got a director for a research center, an associate director. I do extension, I'm an extension professional, right? So I'm a Virginia Sea Grant extension partner, but we didn't do this necessarily as junior faculty. We grew into it. I was always very interested in it. So I would do a project here and there as I was kind of starting my career, building the connections, building the relationships. And then when the opportunity arose to be a Virginia Sea Grant professional, I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. But you kind of slowly build up. You build the connections, you build the skills. So, not only are we not in like everybody else in terms of having a PhD, I think the people who are actually doing a lot more of these applied and engaged research, we're doing it when, when we've kind of now have the opportunity and the flexibility to do that kind of work. So just, this is the time for you to think about, is this for me? To think about what do I think I will get out of it, and what can I start doing now? Not overwhelmingly so, but just what are the small things that I can do to build a skill set, or to find future collaborators or future partners for these applied projects. So with that, I will kind of close the panel, but open it up for questions from the audience. Feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself to ask a question, or type your question in the chat. Anyone?
While they're all thinking, I'm just gonna offer an endorsement for all of you junior folks out there. You just heard a whole lot of what I wished I'd known 20 years ago. And these are probably some of the best people you could probably get, not only to tell you what they just told you, but to answer any specific questions you have. I'm going to mute myself now.
Thank you, Jonathan. Much appreciated.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Luke.
So I'm going to be doing some work for the state of Maryland this summer, and it's going to essentially entail gauging the capacity of states to finance their own school construction. So my concern is that when I'm finished and the state now has more ability to gauge who actually can do things on their own, and thus will need less state support, it's likely to make those people very unhappy. And so I'm curious what the best way to sort of manage this is. Personally, my view is that, just sort of standing back and saying, look, I'm a scientist, I'm just doing what the data tells me, is probably the safest way to go. But you guys have a lot more experience with this, so I'd be very curious to know how you feel about it.
I think I can speak a little bit on that. So that's a similar situation that we've been sort of facing recently with the water rate study, because a lot of these water operators, they see that this is funded by the state, and they just think this is an opportunity for the state to come in and regulate them. And the reason we don't know anything about how they set their water rates is so they're not regulated like the private utilities are, right? So that's been a perpetual challenge of just getting people to talk to us, because they're afraid of that kind of outcome, which sounds very similar to your project. And so what we've done is used our advisory committee. So I'm sure you probably don't have an advisory committee, but we're using people in the field to be our advocates. and to say, hey, this is legit. These guys are not like working, you know, for the man, so to speak. They're just university researchers. They're just doing their job. You know, this helps all of us. And so the more that you can engage with the professional associations, so we've engaged with the Illinois GFOA, we've engaged with the Illinois Municipal League and the Illinois Rural Water Association, and they have sent emails and surveys and advocated on our behalf. Individuals on the committee, they have literally called people and said, hey, we really want you to participate in this interview. So like, you're going to have to probably start to develop some of that network, but use that network. They'll help provide that kind of legitimacy and kind of soften that approach a little bit for you, I think.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And but I'd add a couple things there, Luke. I think to the extent that what you're doing is a largely or entirely data-driven kind of process, right? If you're measuring sort of debt affordability or whatever the concept is, you know, the reality is there's lots of ways to look at that, lots of ways to pull all those data together. You can use that to your advantage and be able to say, you know, methodologically, we can come at this from a lot of different directions, and that might actually have the advantage of some districts coming out relatively well on some metrics and coming out maybe less well on other metrics. And it's always interesting how that can assuage a lot of those concerns if they're not just seen as uniformly bad, but maybe just having some areas to improve on. So don't be afraid to, you know, that's hard to do. It can become just a blizzard of data if you're not careful, but it's definitely one strategy that has worked in situations like this. The other thing I would add to it is, you know, to share an anecdote, we did a study sort of loosely along these lines for the state treasurer in Washington a couple of years ago. Some of you might remember that there was a default on a bond in the city of Wenatchee, which is a smaller community out in the eastern part of the state. They borrowed a bunch of money to build a new convention center and a stadium for a hockey team that never arrived. And so they had a convention center and a stadium that was basically going unused, not generating sales tax. They defaulted on the bonds. And if you know anything about the history of defaults in Washington state, it was also the state that had the largest revenue bond default in history, the Washington Public Power Supply, or WHOOPS as it's called, back in the late 80s. And so whenever you talk about revenue bond default in Washington state, people get very excited very quickly. And so when the Wenatchee default happened, the state treasurer got very concerned, asked us to come in and do kind of a multifaceted study, part of it being to measure basically the fiscal health and the revenue generating capacity of a lot of the special districts throughout the state. There's tons of special districts in Washington state. When you get into those data, you find very quickly that fire districts are some of the most strapped. They tend to have just a property tax and nothing else, and they tend to be overstaffed for a lot of reasons that we can get into. So you have all these fire districts that are on the brink of financial collapse. Fast forward a few years later, we did the study. State treasurer kept it very quiet for lots of different reasons. A few years later, you might recall there was a huge mudslide in Western Washington that completely absorbed a little town called Oso, which is kind of north and west of Seattle. Dozens of people killed. It was a true catastrophe. One of the first things that the state treasurer did right after that happened was went to our findings and saw the fire districts surrounding that area that were fiscally strapped, called those fire chiefs and said, send your people to do search and rescue. Don't worry, we'll make you whole after the fact. Don't worry if you can't afford it, we'll send the check. Just send your people right now. And it literally meant that a bunch of first responders who otherwise would not have gone went to the scene and made a big difference. We would have never imagined that study would produce, you know, that kind of an outcome. But had we known at the time that we were doing that work, that we could have maybe helped to sell the findings a little bit to the districts that were coming out less well as, hey, you never know when it's good for the state to know that you might be in trouble. That would have been, you know, potentially a pretty useful thing as well. So just thinking ahead 2 or 3 steps and being able to kind of sell it that way might make a big difference.
Very helpful. Thank you.
All right, well, we are at time, so I would like to thank Deborah and Justin for joining us and thanking all of our workshop participants for being here today.